like to welcome everybody to the 10th season of the Newness History Lecture Series. And it's kind of a crazy thing. We've been doing it long enough now that we can have a little nostalgia. And especially tonight, looking back for me, since I'm so elderly now and we've been doing this is probably about as long as I've done anything in my life, which is kind of sad, but maybe not. And so I think I mentioned that before. But so tonight especially, we have a very important speaker who was with us quite a bit in the early years, but then been away for a while. So it's great kind of remembering past things to welcome him back, which we'll talk about in a second. As a quick update on the mascot, still trying to work out her schedule, but her agent's being a little difficult to get her here. But the latest thing is she scored 2 goals in soccer this weekend, which is a very big deal. So, also, I want to point out for next month, on November 7th, we're going to have another longtime favorite, Christina Vela, who's going to talk about the history of medicine in New Orleans, which I think is a fascinating topic. It's kind of both interesting and gruesome at the same time, which is the best kind of history, I think. So, but let's move on to tonight's speaker. It's Marty Morgan, who gave several of our best appreciated lectures in the early years. Back at that time, he was the historian at the National D-Day Museum. He has since moved on to be a general all-purpose World War II historian, including doing a lot of TV work and documentary work. The latest of his endeavors is going to air on Thursday on the History Channel, and it's called The History of the World in 2 Hours, I believe. And he's got a bunch of other stuff in the works. So I'm very proud to present Marty Morgan.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out. Let's talk about D-Day. Now, you're probably all well acquainted with the subject of the Normandy invasion. How on Tuesday, June 6th, 1944, the United States, with 11 other Allied nations, conducted a very large-scale opposed amphibious landing operation in northern France in Normandy. You've probably heard all of the details about it before, and it's probably just a little bit of a refresher for you with nothing new for me to say things like it was an overall operational size that compared to nothing that had come before it. It wasn't the largest invasion of World War II. That was the Operation Avalanche, opposed amphibious landing operation at Okinawa during the summer of 1945. But this operation transcended everything else that came before it. With 11 countries functioning as a multinational coalition, you had 150,000 personnel associated immediately with the invasion force alone. The United States contributed the majority of the strength of the operation. You had an amphibious effort, ships at sea numbering over 2,000. We've generated a very popularized image of what the Normandy invasion was, with emphasis and focus on certain aspects of what really is a very, very large and diverse operation. One of the areas that we typically focus on are the photos that you're seeing here. The United States Army's 5th Corps landing at a place called Omaha Beach. Now, the U.S. Army 5th Corps, which was numbering about 52,000 men at the time, consisting primarily of 2 divisions, the 1st Infantry Division and with the attached 29th Infantry Division, composing the spearhead element of the Army's 5th Corps, assault a beach that's 4 miles wide, that's defended by just over 600 men. To refresh the numbers once again, that's 52,000 versus 600. And those 600 men held up the strength of the United States Army Corps, an entire corps, for the better part of 4 hours. Omaha Beach represents the highest casualties of anyone on D-Day. That's not to detract from what Allied nations did on other beaches, Sword, Juno, Gold, particularly at Juno Beach, where the Canadians suffered over 370 killed in action. But it's at Omaha where All branches of the American military experienced the most intense combat. So yes, the Navy was there in large numbers. Of course, it was an Army amphibious landing operation, but in addition to that, you had ships that were crewed entirely by the United States Coast Guard, and even the Marine Corps was present on D-Day. Any Marines here tonight? There's a good takeaway for the Marine. Do we have one Marine in the audience, and that's it? That's rare. There are usually more. You can take that away. Marine Corps was present on D-Day on June 6, 1944, in the form of the Marine detachments aboard the battleships USS Texas, Nevada, and what was the third battleship? Arkansas. Texas, Nevada, and Arkansas. At any rate, all branches of the American military being represented in this operation. This is where combat is the most intense, and because of that intensity, it's the most memorable. In the decades that follow the Normandy invasion, we construct a culture of commemoration around this intensity. During the course of the battle that morning, American forces suffer heavy, heavy losses. And those heavy losses are painfully felt at Omaha Beach. Again, the number is 52,000 men comprising the United States Army's 5th Corps, and intense combat results in just about 1,000 men killed in that part of the operation alone at Omaha Beach. A vicious and intense battle, one of the most intense battles that the United States Army would ever face. The costliest day for the United States Army during the Second World War. Just to give you a little bit of a tracking on the figures, we lose on D-Day, on Tuesday, June 6, 1944 alone, we lose 3,393 Americans killed in action. That's to give you a little bit of perspective on the overall number. Keep in mind, 16 million Americans served in uniform during the Second World War, and out of that 16 million, 405,000 of them never returned home at the end of the conflict. That 405,000 consists of 292,000 who are direct killed in action and killed in combat with the enemy. You have 115,000 additional to that die as a result of illnesses and operational accidents. And the two numbers together give you 405,000 killed total. A very, very large number of Americans, largest loss of life for any American 20th century conflict. I make that distinction simply to accommodate the Civil War and the loss of life in that war. But just about 4,000 Americans lose their lives on D-Day in total. Omaha Beach claims about 1,000 of them, and the others are distributed elsewhere throughout the operation. Americans that come from literally every state and ancillary territory participate in an operation that provides absolutely devastating magnitude. Of course, we had the capability at that stage in the summer of 1944 to deposit an entire fighting corps of 50,000 men onto a beach. And just the ability to organize, to equip, and to provide the sea lift it took to put an entire U.S. Army Corps is devastating to consider, because that number, that devastating and awe-inspiring number, which is really, I think, summarized effectively in this photograph. This is a photograph taken on Wednesday, June 7th, 1944, on the eastern side of the Rouquette River Valley, on kind of dead center at Omaha Beach, near a little town called Saint Laurent-sur-Mer, where you're seeing one of the great strengths that the American military brought to World War II. And that great strength was that we could not only contribute an extremely large fighting force, but we could also contribute the sea lift that it took to move them. We could contribute the airlift as well that it took. We could equip our fighting forces. We could do all of this for our forces, and then we could do things like, for example, we could equip the entire French Armored Division. The French Armored Division fighting using American Sherman tanks, even using American boots, American HVT uniforms, in some cases American 50 caliber machine guns, Thompson submachine guns. We were not only equipping our fighting forces in this massive undertaking, but we were equipping allied nations like the French, the Poles. We often forget that the Poles participated in D-Day, the Czechs, and the list goes on and on. Now that refresher functions just to give you a little bit of a sense of the operation that I wanted to talk about in a fine detail. Now, that's the big picture. Much of the history of the Normandy operation has been written in communication with the big picture. Something that is possible now, and only possible for a very brief window of time, is to hone that all the way down from the bird's eye view to the worm's eye view to the individual level. That individual level is something that you don't find when you visit Normandy today. You find it in a few places. You find signs of the battle. One of the points that I'll be making tonight, time and time again, is that these massive military operations, they have the effect of imprinting themselves on a piece of real estate. They shape a battleground. A battleground, once it has been touched by something as momentous as D-Day, it is never the same again. This is not a particularly enlightened thought. This is not an original thought of any kind. And this seems like a very reasonable place to make the point that you can have an important event like D-Day. You can experience that event on one specific isolated piece of terrain, and it stays there forever. Of course, I'm making this statement just a few miles away from one of the probably most pivotal events of the 19th century, the early 19th century, just a few miles away, and I'm sure you all know what I'm leading to. January 8, 1815. Might remember there was a little battle fought just a few miles from here. It was of great consequence in the overall picture of the ending of the War of 1812. It forever changed the plain at Chalmette and made the plain at Chalmette almost a household name in the way that Normandy, an area that was remote, an area that was not exactly heavily modernized in France, but it is today extremely well remembered. There are signs of battle. German coastal artillery battery at a place called Longue-sur-Mer, or even a visit to look at this, a concrete bunker with a cannon in it, tells you something about Nazi Germany because it's not a German gun, it's a Czechoslovakian gun. The Germans made extensive use of weapons that they had captured from enemy forces in combat, and the weapons that were being made by countries that they enveloped into the Nazi Empire. Czechoslovakia, of course, being annexed into Germany, and all of the ordnance that was being manufactured in Czechoslovakia was put to use, like this gun at Longue-sur-Mer. Every now and then, the signs of battle appear anew. A storm blew into Normandy back during the winter and uncovered this area. If you know Normandy, if you know the Utah or the Omaha Beach area, immediately to the west of Pointe du Hoc is an area called Grand Comte-Mézy. Storm blew in over the winter and uncovered original German beach obstacles from D-Day that are still in the position that the Germans put them in 1943. So the signs of battle are still present, and nature will come in every now and then and uncover them, which I find fascinating. But then also something that has grown up in Normandy that is certainly noteworthy is this breathtaking commemorative culture. This culture that has grown up, that has ensured that every little village throughout Normandy has a museum in it. This is the museum closest to Vierville-sur-Mer at Omaha Beach, where you can find not one but two original Higgins LCVPs. And yes, both of those were made not far from here. Those were Michoud boats that were made in 1943 that helped carry Americans ashore in Normandy in 1944. Kind of linking St. Bernard Parish with the D-Day invasion. In the backyard, an interesting thing in the back of this little museum that maybe to the casual observer would go unnoticed. They might notice this very nice German pack gun. You know, when I say pack, it means Panzerabwehrkanone anti-tank gun. But right out back there, look off to the right of the photo, and what do we have there? That is a Higgins LCPL, the Landing Craft for Personnel Long. That's the first military contract Higgins boat, a type of Higgins boat that, for example, the 1st Marine Division conducted the amphibious landing operation with at Guadalcanal on the Solomon Islands in August 1942. And there sits one with not even so much of a sign to tell you what it is. And it's a wooden boat, and if there's anybody in the room that knows anything about wooden boats, they don't do well when they're left outside all the time. But at least for now, if you're from Louisiana, southern Louisiana, you can come by and you can You can meditate over the fact that there's an original World War II Higgins. This one was probably made at the first Higgins shop, the one that was, the corner of St. Charles Avenue and Felicity downtown. This one probably came from that Higgins shop. There are other signs of the battle, things like there's an underwater wrecks museum where they have recovered American tanks that sank on D-Day. You may know this, you know the story quite well, that there was a special modification to the Sherman tank that was made so that it could float on water. One noteworthy aspect of this design is that it failed, and it failed quite astonishingly on D-Day, with a very large number of Sherman tanks sinking rather than being able to swim ashore. This museum features the fact that these tanks were later recovered from underwater, and that's why they are in this rusted condition that you see here. But nevertheless, fascinating link to the history of this battle that no one would ever see had it not been for this really massive effort to bring them back ashore. Tanks that were, of course, the product of American industry. The M7 Priest that's on the left side of the screen was made at, that would have been St. Louis Car and Foundry, and then a Sherman that was probably made by Ford right next to it. There's the M7 again. Anyway, the signs of battle are everywhere you look. You can visit Normandy today. You can even visit the cemetery. You can go and have a full experience of interacting with the culture of this massive battle, this so important moment in American history, one of the most important moments of the 20th century. You can have an experience where you go there that is not a fully enriched experience to the extent that you know personal stories. You can go and see museums, you can go and look at beach obstacles or tanks that have been raised from the bottom of the English Channel. But you may not necessarily understand some of the personal stories, and that's because of the fact that there has been this tendency to emphasize certain things to the complete neglect of others. There are certain stories in D-Day that we all know well, that we hear time and time again, while at the same time, other stories have been left completely out of the overall narrative of the action. And thus, the commemorative culture that has been created, that has grown up around the Normandy invasion, is exclusive. It means that there is a cafeteria of stories, and for some reason or another, that commemorative culture selects certain stories and leaves other ones by the wayside. I wanted to tell you really quickly about one of the stories that has been left by the wayside. Here, overall view of the operation. Massive operation, of course, as I described, the numbers that are so staggering. And you're seeing at least some aspect of it where you can see the American forces that approached the airborne drop zones from southern England. If you look up to the top of the screen, you can see how large number of aircraft flew toward the Cotentin Peninsula, the peninsula where the American landing sectors were. They flew and approached from its western coast and then landed. Now, just to get in a little bit closer, here you're seeing kind of the map scrolled in on the target area. An area that's kind of bordered by 4 primary cities, Caen, Bayeux, Carentan, and Cherbourg. Now, if you'll notice, you can see 2 areas where the American 82nd Airborne Division and 101st Airborne Division were supposed to land in a series of drop zones and landing zones. Now, we're familiar with the main landing beaches. You can see them marked on the map: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. There's so much emphasis placed on things like Omaha Beach and the massive and intense battle that unfolded there. But if you look just to a little bit to the left of Omaha, right where you see that little red dot that just flashed up, there's a village that the French pronounce as Gragne. It's not exactly easy to pronounce for many Americans. This is a village that I would expect that you might not have heard of before. If anybody's heard of it, raise your hand. It's typically not a story that has been effectively woven into the overall narrative of the Normandy invasion, and yet I think you will be interested in it. And I think you will be interested in it because that story of this little village sits on a hilltop in Normandy. There's a direct line that leads from that village straight back to here, and I'll tell you why. You're seeing the village of Gragne in all of its majesty. 600 residents as of June 1944, built on a little 30-meter hilltop, surrounded almost completely by marshy plains that flooded during the winter months. You can see there's a church with a bricked-in cemetery. There was a grocery. Everybody that lived in this village was involved in dairy farming. The village was just nothing much. It was very, very small. In fact, it's almost invisible in socio-cultural accounts of what it was like to live in Normandy prior to 1944. But this little hilltop in Normandy, in this little village that nobody's ever heard of, ends up becoming a vicious battleground. A vicious battleground that ultimately results in the almost complete destruction of the church. A beautiful 14th century Roman Catholic stone masonry church. It's in almost ruined condition. It's still there, as you can see, but the main elements of the anatomy of the church have been almost completely destroyed. The church was then buttressed and rebuilt in the aftermath of the war to serve as a memorial. And that memorial sits right in the heart of the ruins of the old 14th century church. You can look down, this is a perspective looking down where the pews would have been toward the altar, and there, right behind where the altar used to be, is this large granite memorial plaque that lists the names of French civilians who lost their lives during the second week of June 1944. And then if you look at the score and the names below that, 31 Americans. 31 Americans who jumped into Normandy during the pre-dawn hours of Tuesday, June 6, 1944. 31 Americans who never came home from Normandy. And it's an interesting coincidence of fate and history that two of those names are grouped right together. And you'll notice George Barragona and Benton Broussard. They spelled his name wrong. It's not Burton, it's Benton. With a name like Broussard, can you guess where he was from? It's not hard to guess, is it? There might even be some Broussards in the room tonight. Any? No? That's a rarity in Louisiana, isn't it? We had an assembly with no Broussards present. There's got to at least be a Landry here. Is there? No? Okay, all right, I'll move on. I wanted to mention George Barragona and Benton Broussard because they're two American paratroopers who forfeited their lives on the hilltop at Crimea in June 1944. And they were both from Louisiana. It's very interesting that both of them ultimately came home to Louisiana. We'll start with George Barragona. Barragona, born and raised in Slidell, graduate of Slidell High School, class of 1941. Well known as the starter on the basketball team. Interestingly, George Barragona jumps with his regiment, the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, into that little village. He fights, and on the 11th of June, 1944, shortly before sunset, on the 11th, which was a Sunday, after he had attended Mass in that ruined church, he lost his life on that hilltop. In the aftermath of the Second World War, his family elected to have him returned to Louisiana. And so if you know where Our Lady of Lourdes Cemetery is in Slidell, if you get off the I-10 at the Old Spanish Trail exit and you follow it along to where you cross Front Street, you go over the canal, it's just up ahead on the left. Very, very small cemetery, I think maybe 200 burials, one of which is George Barragona. The reason I'm mentioning him and emphasizing him is that now in Slidell, today, I'm not the only one that visits him, I know that. There are others, family members. This burial plot in Slidell, Louisiana, is a direct link straight across the Atlantic Ocean to the battleground in Normandy, where this man's life came to its tragic and early end. Now, Benton Broussard. Benton Broussard, born Church Point, Louisiana, if you know where Church Point is. Okay, you know where Crowley is. You go 22 miles straight north of Crowley, kind of up around Ville Platte, up in there. That's where Barragona was born. He was born into a household where nobody spoke English. This man was born and raised speaking the French language, or at least a strange variation of the French language. Today in the village of Clagna, there are survivors, and they remember this man, and they remember him because he spoke French so funny. He didn't speak proper French like we do here in Normandy. That's what one of them told me once, which is kind of hilarious because they speak this very, very crude version of French in Normandy that's very hard to understand. Broussard was raised speaking English. It wasn't until he was 12 years old in school, or was raised speaking French. It wasn't until he was 12 years old that he was forced to begin to learn the English language at school. But Broussard lands, and immediately upon landing in the village of Clagna, he served an extremely important purpose in that he was the only person on the hilltop that was capable of communicating with the civilians, which he did. He did throughout the week that they were there. They land pre-dawn on Tuesday. There's a massive battle there on Sunday, and it's the battle where this man loses his life. He's killed, and in fact, the citizens remember the exact spot that he was killed because they remember him, because they all interacted with him, because they spoke the same language. And so there again is another link that puts Louisiana straight into the pocket of the battleground in Normandy. Benton Broussard's family, just like George Barragona's family, in the aftermath of the war, elected to have him returned to Louisiana, and he is now resting in the Catholic cemetery in Crowley. Now, the battle in which these two men lost their lives is one that has largely disappeared. It became remote. It wasn't well reported. It wasn't well covered. No movie was ever made about it. And so because of that, it drifted and faded into obscurity. And it takes massive effort that gets more difficult with each passing year to reconstruct the elements of this story. Elements of the story that can only be restructured by people that were actually there, people that survived to this day, that were present to witness the death of George Barragona or to witness the death of Benton Broussard. Now, the church memorial looks like this today. Right at the turn of the 20th century, it looked like this. Big, beautiful church. And the reality of what actually happened there was that during the pre-dawn hours of Tuesday, June 6, 1944, about 180 American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division landed in the village. Now, the 82nd Airborne Division consisted of 3 parachute infantry regiments, a glider infantry regiment, glider field artillery battalions, and a few supporting units, numbering just about 8,000 American paratroopers and glidermen. The aircraft that carried them to Normandy that night, C-47 Skytrain, a few of those aircraft, 13 of them to be precise, managed to get off course and deposit 184 men off of the drop zone. And when I say off of the drop zone, it's understating it slightly. Okay, if you'll look up to where you can see it says 82nd Airborne Division drop zone, you can see it right about here. I'm going to point at it for you. That's where they were supposed to land. They were supposed to land just immediately to the west of the little town of St. Mary Lees. And instead, these 184 men, including Barragona, including Broussard, they land at Clagna, 25 miles south of the drop zone. They were hopelessly and impossibly off target. The commanding officer that was there that organized them, a U.S. Army major named Charles Johnston, he realized the impossibility of organizing 184 men, exfiltrating 25 miles across enemy-held territory to get back to the rally point at the drop zone. And for that reason, he decided to stay, to keep the men in the village of Clagna. They landed on Tuesday, as I said, and then throughout Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the French did everything they could to accommodate them, giving them food, giving them a place to sleep, making every effort available to the Americans to support them in their overall objective, which was winning the Battle of Normandy. Now, these Americans were extremely well armed. By a complete coincidence, they landed with parachute bundles that carried 6 of their M1919A4 30 caliber machine guns. In addition to the 6 machine guns, they had an estimated 30,000 rounds of ammunition for the 6 weapons. So they had plenty of machine guns and they had plenty of ammo for the weapons. In addition to the machine guns, they landed with also 2 of the M1 81 millimeter mortar. Now I think in history sometimes when we contemplate things like the effectiveness of weapons, I think sometimes we lose track of just how powerful a weapon this is. Do we have any veterans here tonight? We have, okay. Perhaps you might agree with this statement. The mortar was an extremely deadly weapon. The 81 millimeter mortar, the American 81 millimeter mortar, was truly that. So this group of 184 paratroopers, everyone has their individual weapons, Thompson submachine guns, M1 carbines, M1 Garand rifles. Everyone has individual weapons. They then have the 6 machine guns, 30,000 rounds of ammo for them, the 2 81 millimeter mortars with over 500 rounds of 81 millimeter high explosive. So this was no longer a little bedraggled group of lightly armed men. This was suddenly a group of men that, by fortune of war, were extremely well armed. They were occupying a 30-meter hill that dominated the surrounding area. And I should point out that the reason they had the 2 mortars, the 6 machine guns, and all the ammunition for those weapons was because of 2 French girls, a 13-year-old girl and a 19-year-old girl, who looked out in the marsh, the flooded marsh, on the morning of D-Day, and they saw all these little colorful things floating around. And what they saw were equipment bundles that had landed by parachute. When we dropped equipment bundles, they were colored. Some of them were red, some of them were yellow, some of them were orange, and the colors represented what was in the bundle. So that red had ammunition in it, for example. These 2 girls saw it and thought, oh wow, those are probably made of silk, we should go get them. And so these 2 girls spent the entire day, a 13-year-old and a 19-year-old spent the entire day on June 6th collecting up the 18 equipment bundles with these weapons in them, and then placed them at the disposal of the 184 American paratroopers. So in this very interesting way, a 13-year-old girl and a 19-year-old girl made this very small, lightly armed infantry force a small, heavily armed infantry force. I find it absolutely fascinating. Sometimes we envision the French as being passive, as the French as having been present for the liberation, but not active in it. And the reality was that on D-Day, a 13-year-old girl was willing to risk her life to help Americans establish the liberation of France. At any rate, with these weapons, the paratroopers dug in. The Germans ultimately figured out where they were, and during the morning of Sunday, June 11th, 1944, the Germans conducted 3 successive assaults against the little hilltop that I showed you photos of earlier. The first assault was completely devastated. It was devastated mainly by the fire from the 6 machine guns and the 2 mortars. The second assault was also pushed back because of these weapons. The third assault, at the beginning of that assault, the Germans dragged in 2 artillery pieces. They shelled the entire hilltop, the point at which Ferragamo was killed, the point at which Benton Broussard was killed, the point at which most of the French civilians that you saw on the memorial plaque, that's the point where they lost their lives. And then, in a desperate last attempt to hold the Germans off, the mortars fired until they ran out of ammunition. At that point, the enemy overran the hilltop. After overrunning the hilltop, most of the Americans got out with their lives. 184 men, 31 killed. Everyone else actually escaped, got out, and walked back to American lines. They did so little by little over the next few days, but they all got out. 150 of them survived, and that's absolutely miraculous. But in the aftermath of this, when the Germans reached the village and realized that the French had been assisting the Americans, the Germans immediately murdered the 2 Roman Catholic priests. There were two priests that were helping American wounded. Father was Robert Le Blastier and Charles de Babanchon. Germans immediately murdered them upon overrunning the village. They found that Father Le Blastier and Father de Babanchon were tending to 19 American wounded, men who had been wounded in the closing stages of the battle by the artillery bombardment, and they murdered them as well. And so this little village is suddenly no longer just a battleground, it's the site of an atrocity. And yet it's kind of forgotten. It's not woven into the overall narrative of D-Day. Has anyone ever seen the motion picture The Longest Day? Yeah, 1961, Daryl Zanuck movie, blockbuster, fantastic movie. A movie that actually, and one of the points that I'm making here this evening, that movie set the tone for the commemorative culture that we now celebrate for D-Day. That movie is what informs the way that we remember the Normandy invasion. And that movie couldn't do everything. It couldn't tell every story. It didn't tell the story of Kanya. And so one of the things that I'm arguing for is an expanded commemorative culture, a commemorative culture that continues to blossom as time goes by. Something that we can contribute to, not something that we cap off. And one of my opinions about D-Day is that we've capped off that history. And I want us to continue to contribute to it and let it grow. The artillery bombardment that preceded the third wave devastated the church. What had been once a beautiful 14th century Roman Catholic church was reduced to a rubble pile that was about to collapse completely. When the French returned to the village of Cagnes, most of them had to be evacuated at the end of the battle, by the way, the decision was made to convert the ruins of the church into the memorial. And you can actually see in the photo here where they've gone in with wooden beams to buttress the unstable central area of the church so that it could be a memorial. Because to the French suddenly wanted this to be a prominent memory. They wanted what happened in this village to be important, significant, and meaningful. And so they wanted the church to be the key symbol, the beacon that functioned to remember the history of what happened here on the 11th of June, 1944. And what happened was it turned this beautiful church before into the devastated church sanctuary that you see after. So, in an interesting way, you see something that you just don't see anywhere else. You see a church that was converted into a war memorial. And it's something I find completely fascinating. The French, as I mentioned, commemorate this event every year. Every year, on the 11th of June, people from the surrounding countryside come together for a memorial service to remember the French who were killed in the village and to remember the 31 Americans who lost their lives there, 19 of which were wounded and helpless and murdered by a vicious enemy. The main road into town is called Rue d'11 Juin 1944, the street of the 11th of June 1944. And then the other road, the one that leads up to the memorial, is Rue du 57e Régiment d'Infanterie Parachutiste, the road of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Now, where you can see the plaque beneath that, it says En hommage à nos libérateurs du 6 au 11 juin 1944, in honor of our liberators. It's a very thought-provoking snapshot of what commemorative culture really is. The French go out of their way to rename things, to rename streets with the date that something happened, to convert a church that had been standing for hundreds of years into a war memorial. And it differs, the way that they remember it differs so dramatically from the way that we remember it, because we're so far removed, we can't help it. We have the Atlantic Ocean between us and the battleground, or do we? Because I would argue that this battleground, the village of Cagnes in Normandy, that a piece of it is right across the lake in Slidell, but there's another piece in the Catholic cemetery at Crowley. Now let's talk about another village briefly. Seen here from the air, a little village called Saint Mère Église, literally St. Mary's Church. It's on the north-south RN 13 road, the main road going between Bayeux and Cherbourg in Normandy. A sleepy little town before the big highway came through in 1936. A town that got a little bit busier after that. And a town where another famous event occurred. Now, have you heard of this town before, St. Mère Église? Maybe it's a bit more familiar to you than the town I just described to you. They're barely separated by 25 miles, but at St. Mère Église, it's remembered. It's remembered to this day. It's a town that is somewhat haunted by the fact that there was a German garrison in the village. A German garrison of men who would fall out in the church square for formations periodically, men that actually would pose for tourist photographs every now and then in front of a furniture store. Or sometimes in front of the side of the 12th century Roman Catholic Church. So this garrison of a little over 100 Germans in this little town was awakened shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944. They were awakened by the sound of not one, not two, not a few, but hundreds of low-flying, multi-engine aircraft. Imagine what that would do to you. Imagine the blood pressure raise that would trigger when you listen to the first after 5 or 6 twin-engine airplanes flying overhead at 1,000 feet, your heart might start to thump a little bit. After 200, you would probably be at full panic. After 600, who knows what would be going through your mind. But that's what these men underwent. In the middle of this massive fleet of airplanes buzzing over the city at low altitude as they deposited the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division at their drop zone just 2 miles away, right in the middle of it, some piece of debris or a crashing airplane caught a house on fire. The Germans fell out to help put that fire out. And as they were putting that fire out, something very, very interesting happened. The entire French population of St. Mère Église is there fighting the fire. The Germans are there with them, attempting to put out the fire. And then suddenly one airplane zips overhead, lower than all the others, 700, maybe 800 feet. As it zips overhead, paratroopers are stepping out of it. Those paratroopers then come down right in the middle of the church square at St. Mère Église. 16 men come down in the middle of this village. Men that jumped just a little bit too late. The pilot of the aircraft put the exit light to green maybe a minute after he should have, and that minute made the difference between they were right on the drop zone and they were right in the center of a German-occupied city. The 16 men that landed were from the mortar platoon from the 2nd Squad of F Company 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And when they came down in the middle of town, they met Germans that were ready, Germans that knew what was going on, Germans that were awake, they were alert, and they were all armed. Now, what then unfolded was this fascinating little moment in D-Day history that we all know a little bit about now. We've remembered it well, mainly because of the fact that it was depicted in a motion picture. This is the 12th century Roman Catholic Church in St. Mère Église, where every day, no matter what day of the year you visit, hanging from the belfry is a mannequin with a parachute. And if you've seen the movie The Longest Day, you know why. And that's because, can anybody name who it was in the movie, the actor? It's like everyone's seen the movie now. I'll quit talking so much about it now. Yes, the actor Red Buttons portrays a character who gets hung up on the belfry. An interesting side note for you. You see where the mannequin's hanging? That's where Red Buttons was hanging in the movie. That's not where it actually happened. You see the other side, on the other side of the clock, which would be the northwest corner instead of the southwest corner, that's where it actually happened. But they put Red Buttons on this side for the movie because there's a big wide open parking lot where they could get all the camera vehicles and all the lifts. And so there's a funny moment here to the commemorative culture about St. Mary-Église and D-Day, and that is they remember the movie. They remember the location of where this event took place from the motion picture, not from where it actually took place. I'm not criticizing that. I'm saying that isn't that interesting? Isn't it fascinating that this is the extent to which motion pictures have power, and a power that is, I think, timeless. That movie was recorded, is it 50 years ago now? That movie was filmed 50 years ago now. And 50 years later, there's a mannequin hanging where Red Buttons hung. It fascinates me. Now, Red Buttons played the character of a man by the name of John Steele, who was one of the mortarmen in F Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and a man who did not live that long after D-Day. I think he died in 1968. The movie version, with Red Buttons as John Steele, displays him all by himself, suspended from that church belfry, and all of the drama that unfolds around it. I don't want to give the story up. For all of you who have not seen it, there's a Blockbuster nearby, right? Go rent it tonight, although I know you can get it at Walmart on Blu-ray now for cheap, like $9.99. Anyway, in the movie version, it's a depiction of Red Buttons as John Steele hanging there, and all this drama unfolds. The actuality, though, is that John Steele was not alone that night. John Steele was on that church. His parachute came down and snagged, yes, but there were two other men that were with him. One of those men was a man named Ken Russell, who snagged onto the roof of the church as well. But then there's a third man, and that third man is the link between what happened at the church square at St. Mary-Église and where we are right now. A man that has largely been forgotten. John Ray, F Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, born and raised Gretna, Louisiana, right across the river. And what happened with John Ray that night is, in my opinion at least, even greater drama than what happened to John Steele, the guy played by Red Buttons. And here's what happened. John Steele came down, snagged on the northwest corner of the church belfry. Ken Russell came down and snagged on the roof of the narthex and was hanging just off the edge. John Ray came down, landed right in front of the church on the ground, burned in real fast, hit so hard that he broke both of his legs. He curled up in agony, laying there, and his parachute came down and draped over the top of him. Now, this, of course, is in the middle of the town square where there was a fire and the entire town was out. A German soldier noticed the men that came down on the other side of the church. He was running around the church to track down those three men. And as he came around the front of the church, he saw John Ray laying there with his broken legs in complete agony. The German soldier raised his Mauser carbine, chambered one round, pulled back the parachute that was covering John Ray, and as John Ray struggled and in pain, the German soldier shot him in the stomach. The German soldier then turned to look after the other two, chambered a new round, heard something above him, looked up. And when he looked up, he saw Ken Russell hanging from the narthex and John Steele hanging from the belfry. And as he raised his rifle to shoot John Steele, with his last conscious effort, John Ray drew his M1911A1 45 caliber automatic pistol and shot the German 7 times, killing him. Of course, his life then ended right there in the church in front of the main entrance of the 12th century Roman Catholic Church in St. Mary-Église. And John Steele's life continued on into the 60s. Ken Russell's life continued until 1998. And so the house that this man was born to, believe it or not, is still standing, 201 Lafayette Street in Gretna, right near Durbin. You know where Durbin is? That house is still there. I have to go over there every now and then, and when I drive by that house, that's the house where when they packed up his personal belongings back at the base in England, they sent them to that house. I can't drive by that house now. Every time I drive by it, I look at it and I think of John Ray and the very, very violent death that he met in front of that church in Normandy. And so, the Battle of June 6th has reached all the way over to Gretna. Battlegrounds really extend beyond where we typically and customarily think that they did. There are ample examples of it. There are three that I just gave you, three sons of Louisiana whose lives ended, and ended tragically, violently, and far too early in Normandy. They haunt that place. The entire area still echoes of the battle that was fought there, and it's been almost 70 years now. As time goes by, I don't think it's getting dimmer. I think it's actually getting stronger. But it's interesting to contemplate, to kind of meditate over the way that these massive battles are remembered in our cultures. And sometimes other cultures remember them in a very different way. I wanted to talk very briefly, if I could, about a battle that you might remember, something that's a little bit more current. We're going to span in here, just off of the South American continent, to the Falkland Islands. Do you remember it? Oh, God, I remember it like it was yesterday. As a kid, I was glued to the television every single day. And for 72 days, I was glued to the TV, watching this conflict unfold there in early 1982. The Falkland Islands functions as this fascinating microcosm, this fantastic little environment where you can study this idea of the persistence of history, memory, and of commemorative culture. Because to go there, it's even more haunted than Normandy in a fantastic little way. To visit the Falkland Islands today is to step back in time, to a conflict that seems like it was yesterday instead of, well, it's been almost 30 years now. One major thing that just stares you in the face is that you're limited where you can go because there are 150,000 unexploded landmines in the principal areas where people used to live on the island. The mines have been contained now. They, for the most part, don't cause casualties anymore, at least not among humans. Apparently, the mines are quite unforgiving with the sheep and the cattle. But then there are things left over, the debris of battle, just abandoned where it was pushed off, like this Argentine cook stove, Argentine boots and tennis shoes, toothpaste, disposable razors, these little shelters that Argentine troops built, the occasional recoilless rifle that's just been abandoned on one of the ridges overlooking the main town. It's a fascinating thing to go there, to walk around in a battlefield, and I would say for most of us, for the common experience, most people have not walked around on a fairly recent battlefield. But to go to the ridges, the heights above the port city at Stanley and the Falklands, is to receive an object lesson in the power of commemorative culture and history memory. To walk around up there is to walk among what is still dangerous debris of battle. The occasional machine gun tripod still sitting right where it was. You can find spent cartridges all over the place. It's almost to the point where it's not even worth picking them up. But something interesting happened here in 2007. Look at that, machine gun tripods just everywhere you look. It's hard not to enter into this quiet, transcendental meditation of the vicious battle that was fought here. And I think sometimes for at least Americans, we've lost sight of how the battles during June 11th, 12th, 13th, 1982 in the heights above Stanley were actually some of the most vicious combat that we've seen during the last 50 years, where Argentine troops set up in defensive positions with very heavily armed Argentine troops fighting British paratroopers and the Gurkhas. Well, among the things that you find there are signs from this massive last battle. And if you paid attention to this war when it occurred almost 30 years ago now, you might remember some of the things that unfolded, particularly at Mount Longdon. Elements of the British 2nd Parachute Battalion moved into position on Mount Longdon there as they approached toward the city of Stanley, which was the final link in the Argentine conquest of the island. Up the heights of this wind-scoured, rock-faced mountain, the British paratroopers fought toward Argentine mechanized infantrymen from the 7th Mechanized Infantry Regiment having to fight in close combat with machine guns and rifles up rocks like this. And even today you find blankets, Argentine blankets strewn among the rocks, a former little shelter that is now collapsing and falling apart. But the interesting thing happens in 2007, and that is in 2007, the war happened, and then everybody moved on. But at 25 years later, suddenly it seems that the Argentines and the British were both overwhelmed with the impulse to commemorate. And so, visiting circa 2008, which is when I took these photographs, back when I was working down there, visiting at that time period, you're seeing what they did. You're seeing the debris that's left behind, not just from the battle, but from when they remembered the battle 25 years later. And it was absolutely fascinating, and it triggered all of this contemplation, at least for me, about the way we remember battles. You find things like this. You see the little sign for the Spanish-speaking speakers here, you know what it says, but I'll translate it. Aquí Combatiu Bernardo Santos. And this was a soldier, you see where it says REMEC 7, that stands for Regimiento Infanteria Mecanizado, the 7th Mechanized Infantry Regiment of the Argentine National Army. And you see that Bernardo Santos has come back, and he put simply, Bernardo Santos fought here from April through June 1982. And then he says La Plata, which is the suburb of Buenos Aires where he lived. You'll also see little nondescript batches of rocks where the Argentines have etched into the little fighting positions. And on an outing one day in 2008, I walked up with this friend of mine, Patrick, who lived there, and I noticed the canteen just off to his left. I saw that and I went, there's my souvenir from the Falkland Islands. There it is, and I'm taking it home, and it's going to be on the centerpiece in my little war room where I do my work, and I sit and I think about military history. That's going to be the perfect artifact from the Falklands. And then right next to it, underneath a rock, Patrick noticed this little Ziploc baggie with a photograph in it. And as he picked it up, right before I reached down to grab the canteen, he looked at it, and it's a photograph of a man who's about 50 years old with 2 teenagers. And he flipped it over, and in Spanish it said, "My dear friend, I've come back here 25 years later. I've brought my sons with me. I think about what happened to you here that day, every day of my life. I wish you could have been here. I wish you could have lived. I wish you could meet my sons. I named the youngest after you." And when I saw that, I went, I'm not touching that canteen. And left it right where it was, and we put the photo back. It's just far too emotionally powerful for people to undergo the dramatic experience of combat, the dramatic experience of warfare, and to have it imprinted on a piece of real estate, and to have that person drag that war back to Argentina with them. It makes for a very profound experience. And so I say, in the example of the Falkland Islands, you have a case where a canteen is an untouchable relic. Because it simply symbolizes the man that came back 25 years later to remember the comrade that was killed next to him.